But what is important to understand is in the years before what we understand as the scientific revolution, before Galileo, from the 1100s to the 1500s, natural science was a key part of the curriculum for hundreds of thousands of students. And this is 500 years before we even think science really existed. These students studied logic, geometry, mathematics, optics, astronomy, biological issues of reproduction and generation, and they learned arguments for the sphericity of the Earth. In fact, by the 1400s, enrollment in Western European universities reached levels unmatched until the early 20th century. Why did enrollment drop? Well, historians think the Enlightenment might have had something to do with it. The attack against the church actually had a negative impact on enrollment in universities. And so there's a really ironic historical dynamic going on here. Another key force in early science was the Jesuits. The Jesuits alone published over 6,000 scientific papers and texts between 1600 and 1773, including a third of the scientific papers on electricity. The Jesuits were by far the largest scientific organization in the world during this key phase of early modern science. And so when you think about the history of science, you might not think about the Jesuits, but that'd be leaving out a huge part of what was going on in science. There were also religious motivations for doing science. There was the firm conviction that the study of nature itself is an inherently religious activity. And again, we're going to have a whole class devoted to this sort of history, but two key motivations for now, when you think about early modern science, were to gain knowledge on how God actually made the creation. And this was a key theological question. And also to gain knowledge that was lost at the fall. And this was also a key motivation. If you read the work of Bacon, he'll talk about regaining knowledge of the fall as part of the key motivation of why he wanted to pursue the project of the natural sciences. Pioneers of early modern science, such as Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, Boyle, and Faraday, and others, saw their work as part of a religious enterprise devoted to understanding God's creation. Early scientists regarded their scientific activities as philosophical worship of God. And there you can see a text by Robert Boyle there. Robert Boyle, in fact, described natural philosophy as the first act of religion. So science is the first act of religion. Johannes Kepler described astronomers as priests of the high God with respect of the book of nature. And here again we find this doctrine of the two books, that you have the book of Scripture and the book of nature, and scientists are Christian priests for the book of nature. That was their understanding. Oxford historian Peter Harrison says, religious elements were integral to the practice of the early modern study of nature. Natural history and natural philosophy were frequently pursued from religious motives. They were based on religious presuppositions, and they drew their social sanctions from religion. Harrison continues, so inextricably connected were the dual concerns of God and nature that it is misleading to attempt to identify various kinds of relationship between science and religion in the 17th and 18th centuries. Science and religion were not independent entities which might bear some positive or negative relation to each other, and to attempt to identify such connections is to project back in time a set of concerns that are typically those of our own age. So Paul Davies says, on a similar note, that science began as an outgrowth of theology, and all scientists, whether atheists or theists, accept an essentially theologically worldview. And Paul Davies is interesting because he's not a religious person. He's not a Christian. He was an atheist who was led towards a sort of deistic position through his science. But he, as a scientist, acknowledges in the history of science that there is this deeply theological context. And even today, when scientists practice, there's this deeply theological context.